Hi, everyone. This is Natalie Gallimore, the research lead of Decoding Dyslexia Ontario, volunteer physician and a parent of 2 kids with dyslexia. I'm going to run through what is dyslexia. So here we go. As you may have seen by some of the other scientists that speak to dyslexia, most of them will tell you that speaking is natural, that humans have evolved the ability to speak and communicate over tens of thousands of years, and that all cultures have speaking. But reading is not the same as speaking. Some cultures developed reading up to 5,000 years ago, and others even more recently than that. And until the Gutenberg press came out, reading was not considered a normal requirement of most people that were living in the world in the year 1500. So why do people fail to learn to read? Well, you'll see in this there's numerous reasons why. Our specific focus is dyslexia, which is related to understanding how the sounds in words that we speak, the phonemes, relate to the letters that people read and the combination of letters. But there's other reasons that people fail to read, and these collectively are a group of struggling readers. And every classroom in Ontario has struggling readers. And should you have more than one of these problems going on, say dyslexia and English as a second language learner, there might be a problem discerning why the reading struggle is there, but it's important to know that it's present and address it young. And the other piece of information that we know about dyslexia is the methods of teaching students with severe dyslexia with explicit and structured language instruction. It does work for most other forms of reading failure. This is to show you where reading failure with kids with dyslexia happens. This is a diagram that came out around 2000 showing the 2 major strands of reading acquisition, that you have to understand the language, that if you know a word like, let's just say watermelon. So if you know that watermelon represents this green fruit with the red interior, when you read a word that's decoded as watermelon, then in your head, you know it's that fruit with the red interior. But if you don't know what the word watermelon is, even if you decode it successfully and sort of say the word watermelon, but you have no knowledge of what that word means, well, that's a limiting factor and you'll have a trouble being fluent or comprehending what you read. But if you go to the bottom of this strand, we'll get into the area of dyslexia, and that's word recognition. That's knowing that all words that we speak in our language are made up of little increments of sounds, and all these little increments of sounds are actually tied to actual letters and letter combinations in our language. And that's particularly challenging for students with, or children with dyslexia and the students that would appear in your classroom. And as well, there can be working memory challenges, which makes the sight recognition of words very challenging. If you have a poor working memory, instead of having to see a word 10 times before it gets stored in your memory, it might take 100 times to be stored. So if it's an infrequent word, it's really hard to build up a word recognition library in your brain. And you're going to be relying on those decoding skills much more so than somebody that has, a better word retrieval system like that and needs less repetitions of words. This is a definition of dyslexia. It's a brain-based learning disability that you'll read at levels significantly lower than expected. So if you were to take a child from a certain socioeconomic background and compare that child to somebody identical, but child A cannot read, that would be unexpected. They'd say, well, given his background, given his grade in school, given the instruction that he's had at school, they should be reading much better than they are. They should be reading at peers. So it's unexpected, and it is in reading. And it varies from person to person, just like ASD or ADHD. These dyslexia can be mild to severe, and the severity can actually be measured by a psychologist when they do a psychological assessment. They will say that, oh, this particular part of reading is severely impaired, and they can get more understanding of where the most significant impairments are to a person. And then the final highlighted piece from this definition is dyslexia can be inherited in some families. And this is really important because the heritability is high. It's been estimated to be anywhere from 50 to 70%. And so if a parent or if an aunt or an uncle have dyslexia, it's really important to know this, because then you can be watching your child for signs that they're going to struggle to read. It's a risk factor, and when there's risk factors involved, it's important to be monitoring and being especially observant so that it can be caught early. So dyslexia is not dependent on socioeconomic status. That's meaning how much money the family has. It's not dependent on intelligence. You could be gifted in dyslexia. You can be slightly lower IQ and dyslexic, because it is primarily gene and base, but then it can be influenced by environment. It has little to do with the IQ, and it's not dependent on a parent's level of education. A parent that has a university degree or even a PhD, if they have relatives that are dyslexic, their child may be dyslexic, and that parent educational level may help understand dyslexia or be able to, procure services, but it will not do anything to change the fact that the child has been born with dyslexia. What do we know about dyslexia? Well, because we don't screen for it, we can only take a ballpark estimate of how many kids have dyslexia. So we'll say 6 to 17%, but studies from England, where they do a little bit more screening in their checks in the primary grades of school, it's more likely maybe down between 6 and 10%. We don't know. Until we screen everybody, we can't actually have an accurate figure. It's a specific type of learning disability, and its main feature is the failure to read. You may have problems in the future. Spelling and particularly word-based math is challenging, word problems. I've mentioned this mild to severe, it's heritable, it's poor phonological awareness, poor rapid automatized naming. This is just quickly coming up with words. If somebody flashes an image in front of your face, how fast can you name that? Something simple like the color red. And it's like, if you look at it, you say, oh, gee, like it takes a while for that word to come out your lips. That is how fast you can name something. And kids with dyslexia frequently have a slower speed for being capable of doing that, and a poor working memory. And so, and I've mentioned earlier that it can co-occur with outside conditions, such as English language learners or your parents, family income, low socioeconomic status, but it can also co-occur with other medical and mental ailments. So it's common to occur with ADHD. It's estimated somewhere between maybe 20 to 30% of kids with dyslexia also have ADHD. There's a relationship there. You can have it with autism spectrum disorder. As well, you may have a central auditory processing disorder, which is how you hear tones and sounds, and that can co-occur with dyslexia. And when you have a co-occurrence, it can make it harder to remediate the dyslexia, just the more layers. This is a diagram showing about the high heritability. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be the parent that has dyslexia. Commonly it is mom or dad, but sometimes you'll see it floating amongst the family as, failure to learn to read or failures in spelling. And again, it's just nice to know your family history, because then you can be monitoring the child for being at risk. Because it is, anywhere from, like I said, 6 to 17%, plus there's a whole other cadre of struggling readers. You're going to have struggling readers in every class, and you're specifically going to have a child with dyslexia in every classroom. So the teachers need to know how to identify the struggling readers and the children with dyslexia, because the children with dyslexia do need to be taught the phonological awareness, the letter to sound associations, and then they need a very structured reading program that will take them through to they are able to read as competently as their peers. And students with dyslexia can learn to read. Don't let anybody say, oh, they have dyslexia. No, we're not going to teach them to read. Instead, your child will do this. Yeah, no, children with dyslexia can learn to read. Let's be clear. So dyslexia can affect your reading, your health, particularly your mental health. Anxiety and depression can grow if the dyslexia is not addressed. It can affect your life in that if you're not a competent reader, it's harder to read signs, it's harder to vote, it's harder to read prescriptions that your doctor gives you. Your career could be limited. You may not pick a career where reading is a principal requirement because you know that you're going to be struggling for the next 40 years to fulfill your obligations as the people working in the same career around you. Math, word problems are a great challenge. Spellings, let's not get there. Even if you remediate the reading, spelling will continue to be a very challenging aspect of writing for somebody with dyslexia. Education, you may pick a different pathway if you're not a competent reader. You may, in high school, pick what they would call applied courses, ones that would prepare you for college, but not for university, because early on, if you can't read, you may say university is not for me. And words, sometimes with dyslexia, you'll have problems with word recall, and you'll become a walking thesaurus, because when you can't recall one word, you'll just throw in another word in there. And obviously with reading, we've already said that reading is, and failure to learn to read is a key early indicator. This is a timeline about dyslexia, just to let you know how far it goes back. This timeline starts back in 1877. That was when a German doctor coined the term dyslexia. And then we will proceed moving right into the current state. But up until 1980, if you were severely dyslexic, the Ontario Ministry of Education didn't actually have to educate you. In fact, all special education needs students didn't have a legal right necessarily to education. They could put you in an institutionalized care or somewhere else, but not necessarily guarantee you the same education that kids without disabilities did not have. Then from our own Ontario perspective, 1986, there was a research, in fact, he's still with you at Toronto, Keith Stanovich, and he coined a term called the Matthew effect for struggling readers, meaning that if in grade 1 a child is struggling and can't keep up with his peers, that because they're struggling so desperately just to decode basic texts, that as their peers become even better readers at a faster rate than that poor struggler, that the gap that exists in grade 1 is going to spread as you go up in grades. Therefore, the Matthew effect means that the strong get stronger and the poor stay weak or get more desperate. And this is a principal reason why identifying dyslexia early and intervening early is to limit both the skill and the learning gaps that occur throughout the primary and elementary school grade. In 1990, the provincial demonstration schools in Ontario began to cater to learning disabilities. Up until then, they've principally been schools for the deaf and for the blind, but then now you could have a residential setting for the severely learning disabled. And then in the year 2000, we finally had some guidance from the US through their National Reading Panel report, whereby they took 2 years to look at 100,000 reading studies that had been conducted between the 1960s and the year 2000 to see if there was any insight into reading instruction. And the panel came out with what we would call the 5 pillars of reading. And they conclusively said that not only struggling readers, that all children benefit from being taught phonemic awareness, that is the letter to sound associations. This is explicit instruction in kindergarten. That was one of their conclusions by groups that were working on the panel. And then in 2009, a similar type of in-depth reading study was done in the UK, and that generated the Rose Report. And unlike the United States, in the UK, when they came out with evidence promoting that there was actually an evidence base to instruction reading, the UK changed its methods of teaching reading. They updated the teacher training. They put in something they called phonics checks at different stages of early primary grades. And their reading results have been improving over the past decade, but it's been hard to manage this large scale change that happens across teaching curriculum, the large governance, as well as right down into the school level. And the last item that I've put on this, and you can't probably see it due to my video, but that is the year 2017, and it's a mention to U.S. journalist Emily Hanford, because she published a documentary on reading and on dyslexia, a number of articles actually in 2017. And as much as reading had been discussed over the preceding 2 decades, those articles really were widely circulated and got a conversation started on the science of reading. Is there a better way to teach reading, and how can we better identify and ensure that children with dyslexia can learn to read in public schools just like their non-disabled peers. And what we do know from this slide, even though Emily wrote that story in 2017 about the evidence, this is just harking back to reading research that's been conducted in the United States and Canada. The NHI in this slide stands to the National Institutes of Health. It's a research body run by the federal government in the US, and they fund research. And these are all centers that since 1985 either were in existence or were created specifically with researchers dedicated to the science of reading, the neurology of the reading brain, how we acquire reading skills. And you'll notice from the red circle that we do have a funded center in Toronto, and it's located at 6 Kids Hospital. And Lovett refers to Dr. Maureen Lovett, and she was the head of the Learning Disabilities Program at Sick Kids. So when Sick Kids has data on children, if some of your children have gone into Sick Kids and received an evaluation, some of that data, once they strip it of your child's name, can be shared with all these other centers. And this is how they're able to come up with data sets of, of children in the thousands. And they can look at similarities across large data sets to understand where the evidence takes them as far as providing evidence-based instruction, as well as identifying these kids that have dyslexia. Newer evidence from 1985, when the National Institutes of Health was set up, there's been 2 types of programs that have received a lot of funding since 2000. These are the genomes, and you've heard about the Human Genome Project, whereby we could use supercomputers to understand our genetic code. That was one thing that happened, that we were going to be able to understand dyslexia better due to that scientific advance. And the other is MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, and we're going to apply that to the human brain. And using that technology, we can actually see what a brain at rest looks like and what a reading brain looks like. And by comparing reading abled people to the reading disabled, we can see how the networks and the interconnectivities differ between those that can and those that cannot. So what we know from the genes, as scientists have identified at-risk genes. So you've heard about the at-risk genes, say for breast cancer or for Alzheimer's disease, that, if you have a gene, it doesn't mean you're going to get the disease. It just means that you're more at risk. So be on the lookout. Same can be said for dyslexia. They've identified, I think, 9 or 10 genes now. None of them conclusively say, oh, well, if you have this one, this particular element of dyslexia will appear at age 2. Nothing is that conclusive. Just like they know for the other conditions, they know it's genetic, they know it's heritable, and they have some at-risk genes, but how those genes interact individually and how they interact with one another, that's still being worked out. It's just important that you know it's heritable. It's been proven that we have some at-risk genes that the research is continuing on, and you and your educators and teachers should know that dyslexia is in the family when it is in the family. From the MRIs, I said that they can compare your typical readers to your dyslexic readers. So the slide on the side shows you how many activation areas there are in a typical reader. So we know that certain areas of the brain activate when you're reading and decoding words. And we know that these brains connect on different pathways, and that there's speeds of that these things transfer the information. And there's scientists that They are experts in this. They scan, oh, you know, a number of children. There's longitudinal studies, meaning that some children that were first scanned at age 2 or 3, they're being followed and scanned, you know, as they progress. And all of this is feeding into what we know about reading acquisition, and if there's anything that we can do better. Like, can we identify earlier? Can we start an intervention earlier? These are some books if you're interested on learning more about dyslexia. The first one is by Linda Siegel. She's actually out of the University of British Columbia. She studied reading for years, starting her career at the University of Toronto and then moving into BC in the early 2000s. Mark Seidenberg, Language at the Speed of Sight. He's a neurologist. He speaks a lot to the reading acquisition from a brain functionality point. And finally is Sally Schweitz. She's from Yale University. The book title, if you can't see, do a little video clip. It's called Overcoming Dyslexia. And it was just updated and revised recently. So if you buy it, you're getting a refreshed issue from the original version that came out in the mid 2000s, like 2005, 2006. And that's all. Thank you very much for listening to What is Dyslexia?